Hello there. We are beginning a new topic here in Honors U.S. History. This will be the Presidency of John F. Kennedy, Part 3, Civil Rights. And the first subtopic for this test material will be the Civil Rights Movement in America. And when President Kennedy took office in January of 1961, a very troublesome topic for him was civil rights. Actually, civil rights began in America back in 1954 when the United States Supreme Court had declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. That was a Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And that decision by the Supreme Court began the long fight that became known as the Civil Rights Movement in America. Now, President Kennedy strongly believed the federal government should pass laws to guarantee equal rights for Negroes. Needless to say, this was not the consensus of all Americans, especially white Americans at this time in United States history. Civil rights was also, if you remember, a major campaign issue in 1960. Kennedy, during the campaign, openly criticized the Eisenhower administration during the campaign for not doing enough in this area. And early in his presidential administration, President Kennedy did three things to improve the civil rights issue. Number one, President Kennedy established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, also known as CEEO. And this organization made sure that companies that work for the federal government gave every person, no matter their race, an equal opportunity for employment. The second thing that President Kennedy did concerning civil rights early in his administration is he directed his brother Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department to support the efforts of blacks to vote in the Deep South. A lot of African Americans, or Negroes as they were called at that time, were even afraid to go to the polls to vote, so many did not vote in elections. And the third thing that President Kennedy did early in his administration to promote civil rights is he made three key appointments in his administration. He announced Carl T. Rowan, who's on the ID sheet, as U.S. Ambassador to Finland, Andrew Hacker as Assistant Press Secretary to the President, working under Pierre Salinger, and he also appointed a familiar name, Thurgood Marshall, as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals. And we all know that Marshall went on to become the first African American Justice of the Supreme Court. Our second subtopic under civil rights is early struggles in the civil rights movement. And during the Kennedy presidency, 7 major events happened in the United States concerning the civil rights issue. The first happened in 1961 and was known as the Freedom Riders. And in 1961, the Freedom Riders set out for the Deep South to defy what was known as Jim Crow laws and call for change. The Freedom Riders, keep in mind, consisted of both black and white members of the civil rights movement. Here are some examples of Jim Crow laws. 1, black people being forced to sit at the back of the bus or stand when a seat became available for a white person. 2, public establishments such as hotels and restaurants banned Negroes. And 3, Negroes were forced by law to use separate restrooms and drinking fountains than white people. The Freedom Riders' intention in 1961 was to ride Greyhound buses from Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama to protest segregation in bus stations. And in Birmingham, the Freedom Riders were beaten and harassed before ever departing. Despite the violence toward them, the Freedom Riders promised to carry on their peaceful protest to Montgomery. However, the issue at hand now was trying to locate bus drivers who wanted to take on the responsibility to drive the buses under those circumstances. Providing a bus driver was the responsibility of the Greyhound Bus Company and also required by law. Because of the issue, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was forced to call the Greyhound Bus Company personally to ensure the company would provide drivers for the Freedom Riders. Once a bus driver was secured, Robert Kennedy then directed John Siegenthaler, who is also on your ID sheet, a member of his Justice Department staff, to travel to Montgomery to observe the Freedom Riders. Bobby actually wanted Siegenthaler to report the happenings directly back to him in his office in Washington, D.C. to ensure the situation was kept under control. Well, when arriving in Montgomery, the Freedom Riders, as expected, were greeted by a mob as they got off the bus. There they were assaulted, along with being beaten with bats. They were kicked and punched repeatedly. While trying to provide assistance to the Freedom Riders, John Siegenthaler himself was beaten. And all this violence against the peaceful protest occurred as local police officers and FBI agents looked on. Robert Kennedy was absolutely furious at this whole situation concerning the Freedom Riders, and he called FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who is also on your ID sheet, asking for an explanation of the events that occurred during the Freedom Riders' peaceful protest. The second example of civil rights in the Kennedy administration you're kind of familiar with happened in 1962 at the University of Mississippi. And it was on September 20th, 1962 that James Meredith, a black military veteran, was denied admission at the University of Mississippi. Meredith had joined the Air Force immediately after high school. He served his country from 1951 until 1960. And after his discharge from the Air Force, Meredith attended Jackson State College for 2 years and then wished to enroll at the University of Mississippi to complete his degree. Well, Meredith was personally prevented from registering for classes at the University of Mississippi by Governor Ross Barnett, who is also on your ID sheet. Now, pressure from the Kennedy administration forced Barnett to allow Meredith's enrollment, which led to violent riots. The results of these riots included 2 people dead, 48 soldiers injured, and 30 United States Marshals suffering gunshot wounds. Because of all the violence, President Kennedy was forced to send in over 5,000 federal troops to restore order on the campus of the University of Mississippi, and Meredith remained at the college protected by federal troops who actually escorted him to class. The third happening concerning civil rights during the Kennedy administration occurred in 1963. It was the SCLC versus Birmingham, Alabama. And in 1957, going back, Martin Luther King Jr. joined with Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, and Bayard Rustin, who will come up later in our lecture, to form what was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. The SCLC was a civil rights organization that was based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC planned a peaceful demonstration to try and end segregation in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. Now, at that time in history, actually segregation was legal in Birmingham and enforced by local authorities there. Because they would be protesting a legal act looking for change, Dr. King insisted that this desegregation drive be peaceful without violence. Well, on May 3rd, 1963, the SCLC was joined by more than 1,000 black children who left school to join in the demonstrations. An estimated 2,500 people showed up in Birmingham for the peaceful protest against segregation, and they were immediately met by Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor and a force of police officers. The officers were equipped with some unique weapons, including electric cattle prods, snarling dogs, and fire hoses. That evening, television news programs shared to the nation scenes of fire hoses knocking down school children and dogs attacking individual demonstrators. Many of the civil rights volunteers were arrested and jailed for violating the segregation laws. So those beaten and treated poorly were actually sent to jail. Well, public outrage forced the Kennedy administration to intervene again when Birmingham exploded with rioting and violence. Again, the president sent in troops, this time 3,000, to restore order in the city. On May 10th, 1963, a settlement was announced ending the violence there. Downtown businesses agreed to desegregate and eliminate discriminatory hiring practices, and city police released all jailed prisoners during the riots. The fourth instance at the during the Kennedy administration concerning civil rights occurred also in 1963 at the University of Alabama. And on June 11, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace personally prevented 2 Negro students from enrolling at the University of Alabama. Wallace actually stood in front of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama and publicly promised, quote, segregation in the state of Alabama today, tomorrow, and forever. This stand by Governor Wallace became known in civil rights history as the stand in the schoolhouse door. Wallace finally stood aside when confronted by federal marshals and members of the Alabama National Guard, also Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the Attorney General under President Kennedy at that time, also stood in sight. He worked for Bobby Kennedy as an assistant. President Kennedy also sent Deputy Director Nicholas Katzenbach to Tuscaloosa to oversee the events, which I just said, and Negro students Jimmy Hood and Vivian Malone were then admitted to summer classes without incident. That night, President Kennedy addressed the nation on the issue of civil rights, and the reason for his national television speech was to introduce a new civil rights bill he would soon be sending to Congress. This new bill would be eventually called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, as you can tell by the name of that was passed in 1964 after Kennedy's assassination. In his speech, Kennedy stated the following that evening: "This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. Are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is a land of the free except for Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens except Negroes?" Well, the fifth event that happened, unfortunately, during the Kennedy administration concerning civil rights occurred also in 1963, and it involved a person by the name of Medgar Evers. Just hours after Kennedy's speech in the early morning of June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers, president of the Mississippi NAACP, pulled into his driveway after returning from a meeting. He emerged from his car carrying NAACP t-shirts that read, "Jim Crow must go." Evers was then shot in the back, and the bullet then ricocheted into his home. He staggered some 30 feet toward his house before collapsing and was pronounced dead 50 minutes later at a local hospital. Mourned nationally, Evers was buried on June 19, 1963 in Arlington National Cemetery, receiving full military honors. And we will take you to Medgar Evers' gravesite when we take our DC trip in April. On June 23, 1964, Byron de la Beckwith was arrested for Evers' murder. 2 different all-white juries deadlocked, thus allowing Beckwith to escape justice. This decision caused a social uproar among both blacks and whites in the civil rights movement. In protest of this, musician Bob Dylan wrote a song entitled "Only a Pawn in Their Game" about Evers and the assassination. In 1994, 30 years after the previous 2 trials had failed to reach a verdict, Beckwith was again brought to trial based on new evidence. Evers' body was exhumed from his grave for autopsy for the trial in a very good state of preservation because of the embalming process. Beckwith was finally convicted of murder on February 5, 1994. After living as a free man for 3 decades, he was given a life sentence, dying in prison in January of 2001 for the murder of Medgar Evers. Before Evers' body was reburied, a new funeral was staged. This permitted Evers' children a chance to see him, as they were very young at the time of his assassination and had very little memory of their father. The 6th event that happened during the Kennedy administration concerning civil rights is the one most known. It happened on August 28, 1963, and it was entitled The March on Washington. On June 18, 1963, President Kennedy sent a new civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is what it eventually became called, to Congress. This new law would make discrimination illegal in regards to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It would also require the desegregation of all hotels, restaurants, theaters, and all other businesses that were segregating Negroes at the time. Now, supporters of this legislation organized a civil rights march on Washington, D.C. for jobs and freedom. The organization of the march would be the responsibility of someone we talked about before, a member of the SCLC, Bayard Rustin. The march would be a peaceful protest march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, and at the Lincoln Memorial, selected people would sing and give speeches in support of the Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights March would become the largest demonstration in American history. When news of the march reached the White House, President Kennedy tried to discourage it. He feared that Congress would see this demonstration as negative and vote against his civil rights legislation. However, on August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 citizens, black and white, marched from the Washington Monument and gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. One man came 1,000 miles from Chicago all the way on roller skates. Millions of Americans also watched the events on television, and because of the crowds, Washington, D.C. was shut down for the day, and over 1,000 law enforcement officers were placed on duty. A man that was very visible at the march was A. Philip Randolph, an elderly civil rights leader who was 75 years old at the time of the march. Randolph had actually tried to organize a similar march on Washington in 1941. And this new march that we saw in 1963 was modeled after his earlier idea. So A. Philip Randolph was quite proud in the new effort. At the conclusion of the march, several people spoke on civil rights, including Randolph, who stated, "We are not a mob. We are the advanced guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. This revolution reverberates throughout the land, touching every city, every town, every village where black men are segregated, oppressed, or exploited." Another member of the civil rights movement scheduled to speak was John Lewis. Lewis was a young, radical civil rights advocate, and his speech was aimed at support of the civil rights legislation, which was initiated by President Kennedy. Instead, it was Lewis's intention to state he could not support Kennedy's bill. Lewis believed that President Kennedy's efforts towards civil rights, in his words, were, quote, "too little, too late." Both civil rights leaders in the White House were very concerned about Lewis's planned speech, as it would be negative. And as the program approached, many people tried to convince Lewis to alter his intended speech, and Lewis refused, wanting to speak his mind on civil rights issues. Finally, A. Philip Randolph met with Lewis privately and asked him not to do anything negative at the march. And Randolph explained to Lewis, quote, I wanted all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it." Lewis agreed and altered his speech to a more positive tone on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Some of the day's strongest words at the Lincoln Memorial actually came from Walter Reuther. He was a white labor union leader who spoke in support of the bill. Reuther had transformed the United Automobile Workers into a major force in both the automobile industry and also within the Democratic Party. And these were the words of Walter Reuther. "I am for civil rights because I believe that freedom is an indivisible value, that no one can be free unto himself. And when Bull Connor and his police dogs and fire hoses destroy freedom in Birmingham, he is destroying freedom in Detroit. We cannot defend freedom in Berlin so long as we deny freedom in Birmingham." That final quote was a direct shot at President Kennedy, who actually watched the march from the White House, basically not wanting to put himself in the spotlight of the march itself. Along with the nonviolent celebration and words of encouragement, the one speech that caught the nation's attention the most was the one given by Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was introduced at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial by A. Philip Randolph, and Dr. King's speech will be long remembered in American history as the I Have a Dream speech. Here are some excerpts from that speech that you might have heard. So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. When we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The most famous parts of King's speech were not in his original text. It was all ad-libbed. His speech, which was written to last 4 minutes, lasted 16. The Kennedy administration was very pleased with the events of the Civil Rights March on Washington. The positive effects of this famous march did influence votes through Congress for the bill. As a result, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did pass. It passed during the administration of Lyndon Johnson, when he served out the remainder of President Kennedy's term after Kennedy's assassination in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. So, what happened to Martin Luther King's famous speech? A young man by the name of George Raveling had an unusual thing happen to him at the conclusion of King's speech that day. Raveling was a 26-year-old former college basketball player who was a last-minute volunteer who had earned a coveted spot near the podium where Dr. King gave his speech. Right after King concluded his speech with free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, he started to fold it when Raveling asked him if he could have the copy. Dr. King handed the speech to Raveling just as a rabbi came to congratulate King on his speech. Raveling actually tucked that speech away in an autobiography of President Harry Truman entitled Year of Decisions that he had owned. And Raveling eventually embarked on a very successful career as a college basketball coach at both Iowa and the University of Southern California. And he never really looked at the speech for the next 20 years. Well, in 1984, during an interview while serving as basketball coach at Iowa, Raveling was asked if he was ever involved in the civil rights movement. He answered the reporter, well, kind of, and told him the story. Raveling then found the speech right where he had left it in the Truman book, in the bookshelf of his office. And the speech has been since framed and has spent the last 30 years in a bank vault. At the age of 76, Raveling considers himself the guardian of the speech, and he recently stated in an interview on CBS News, "This speech belongs to America. The speech belongs to black folks. It does not belong to me." Raveling has been offered as much as $3.5 million for the speech, but he has turned down all offers stating, quote, "There are more important things in life than money." And our final event that occurred during the Kennedy administration concerning civil rights was a very tragic happened. It was called the Birmingham church bombing. On September 15, 1963, one of the worst crimes in the civil rights movement occurred at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 young girls attending Sunday school were killed when a bomb exploded at the church. The young girls were all under the age of 14 years old, and they included Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins. 20 others were injured in the bombing, including 12-year-old Sarah Jean Collins, who was blinded in one eye for life in the explosion. The single example of violence that you hear about here today showed the American people, less than a month after Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, how far we really were away from his dream. 4 white supremacists were under investigation within days after the bombing. After 2 years of investigating, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declined to continue the case. Hoover believed the chances of conviction were remote, and federal authorities shut down their investigation. However, in the 1970s, prosecutors reopened the case, and in 1977, nearly 14 years after the crime, prosecutors convicted a man for the bombing. Robert Chambliss, the ringleader of the bombing, was convicted on 1 count of murder in the death of Denise McNair. He was sentenced to prison and died there in 1985 without ever admitting a role in the bombing. 2 of the 3 remaining suspects in the case were convicted in 2000, both given life sentences in prison. And the 4th man avoided prosecution as a result of his own death in 1994. Well, kids, that concludes, in a quick nutshell, the notes for the civil rights movement. We will probably have a review either before or after you get back, I'm not sure. Hopefully you'll be back in time to take this test. But I'm hoping that you pick this up on video during your trip to the FFA convention and keep up on what we're doing. Hope you're having fun, and we'll see you when you get back sometime next week. Peace.